Let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name's Bob Grupp. I'm host and director of Stratcom World, our annual conference on strategic communications that will take place on May 24th and 25th, 2021 at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Welcome to our webinar today. We're glad you're here. This is one in a series of webinars and podcasts featuring speakers from Stratcom World, as well as guest experts on topics we think that are hugely relevant to our profession. This morning or afternoon or evening for some of you, we have more than 80 people from 13 countries attending, and we're delighted by that turnout. Thank you for your time and for your attention. Welcome. The format for today's webinar will be for our guests to make a few brief opening comments, but then open it up to Q&A among the guest experts, but with you as well. We'd like this to be highly interactive. If you have questions, please click on the chat room link at the bottom of your Zoom screen and post your question there for starters, if you would. And you can post those questions whenever they occur to you through the hour. Today's topic is timely. With the world reeling from the health and economic impacts of COVID-19, and in my country, with the civil unrest that has occurred in cities around the country over the last week, the global media is saturated with dramatic images, digital information, misinformation, disinformation. It's a complicated media environment. So today's session is intended not only to address the scope of that problem, but especially to look at the strategies the strategies to deal with it. And that's what our participants will do in their talk this morning. So with that, let me turn it over to Bob Pearson, who's going to moderate today's discussion. Bob is one of the pioneers in social media marketing, having worked in digital communication, strategic communication for corporations in the United States and in other countries, for agencies, and for government ministries and agencies as well. He's the author of 4 books. They're all fascinating, and I encourage you to look at those if you haven't already. So with that, Bob, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you to introduce the topic and our guest.
Thank you, Bob. It's always a pleasure to be part of Stratcom World. You always have very interesting panels and people, so glad to be part of it. We have an excellent panel today, which we'll get into, on the future of digital disinformation. I will give a couple of brief remarks just to set the scene, and then we'll have our panel, which will each speak for about 7 minutes or so, and then we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A because we want to hear from you and answer questions that you have. So, joining me here, Faisal Al-Mutar is the founder and CEO of Ideas Beyond Borders. He has some very interesting examples of what can be done in the Middle East and also just in reaching the Arabic-speaking world in general. I think it's an example that can be used, examples that can be used well beyond Arabic. Sean Powers is the Chief Strategy Officer for the U.S. Agency for Global Media. And you're going to hear Sean kind of take us back a little bit and say, okay, what is actually happening here with disinformation? Because we have a tendency to just look at whatever's in the news today, but not take that time to actually step back and say what's actually really happening. And then Franek Vayakorka, who's joining us from Belarus, will be talking to us about techniques and insights and things that he's learning because he's continually researching what is next, what is happening, whether it's from Russia, China, you name it, could be anywhere. What is happening and what does it mean? And then we'll go right to Q&A. So for me to just set the scene here, if we think about the new world order of media worldwide, we have 2 companies in the world, Facebook and Google, that reach the majority of the 4.5 billion people who are online. That's through Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, and Facebook Messenger, and then Google and YouTube. It doesn't mean that there aren't many outlets that are used locally. There are, but it's interesting how the media has completely changed. The mobile phone is the center of the universe for nearly everyone on the planet. The average age of people getting their first phone is 10 years old. If we look at how our content consumption has evolved, we make decisions on content that comes at us in 1 to 3 seconds. It's usually actually 1 to 2 seconds. So the ability for us to understand what we're seeing is a little bit tougher than ever. At the same time, we look at how we are respecting authority figures. And so what we're seeing is that the authority figures of yesterday might have been the news anchors. And it doesn't mean they still can't be, they can be. But we're also seeing authority figures be people that just have big followings in social media. So understanding how that is happening is also key. And then if we look at the how bad actors are evolving, there's many ways, and that could be a day-long session. But they are using cross-platform techniques to reach us very effectively. In other words, using Twitter to reach us and Google to bring us to a site. There's a shift to privacy-based platforms. It's never been easier to hide, whether you go into an encrypted message platform or you go into the dark web, and then you come back out into the public web. So our ability to understand what people are doing is actually evolving as well. So we can see those clues. It's never been easier to manipulate personas, to start bot network conversations, to basically create many artificial ways to perhaps fool us, disinform us, shift us in different directions. So we're in a sense in a race here to for the hearts and minds of people who actually just want to live a good life. And if you think about it, 7.7 billion people on Earth, the majority of us just want to live a good life and be good people. Very few people that want to make life different than that. But yet they're there. So hence we start our panel here. So Faisal, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off with the great work that you are continuing to do.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks so much for the great introduction, Bobby. Really made the scene really well. So my name is Faisal Saad Al-Mutar. I'm originally from Iraq. Iraq is a kind of an interesting case on the subject of information. We moved from an Orwellian two-state channel run television to post-war Iraq, in which we have 1,000 newspaper, 1,000 magazine. And to give you kind of an anecdote of what the scene of information was before in my young years under the regime of Saddam Hussein, is that many of us did not know that Iraq invaded Kuwait. The two mainstream television have put on the story that we were invaded by the United States of America and we won that war. And if you survey many people informally today, or even if you surveyed them 10 years ago, you would get the same answer, that we were actually invaded and there was no such a thing as an invasion of Kuwait. So that kind of tells you what kind of the propaganda, state-run propaganda in that way was really effective in the psyche of the people. And then post-war, we have the kind of more sectarian, politicized information that is coming inside the country, but also in some cases outside from neighboring countries in like Iran and kind of Gulf states, and also the more broad, the Russia and China and the United States. So one of the reasons why we believe that kind of the misinformation that thrives a lot in the MENA region is based on what are the demographics there. It's a very young population. There's about people who are under the 29 age, are about 2/3 of the population. Based a lot of studies by the United Nations that many of them are digital savvy in the broad sense of digital savvy, but many of them are unskilled and significantly less educated than global peers. And many of them cite feeling of hopelessness because of decades of war and unrest. And at the same time, they're desperately looking for positive change, which kind of creates a very fertile ground for all kind of motivational content to be able to succeed. So they are looking for change, but unfortunately, on the information sphere, they cannot find a lot of reliable and empowering content. And on the language side, very little of the internet is actually exist in Arabic. And considering that most of people that are monolingual, which means that they're very much relied on Arabic speaking content. And some stats that it's only 0.9% of the internet is in Arabic, and some say it's about 3%. So it's definitely much less by comparison to how much population is there. So this is kind of the landscape that we as an organization operate at, and we're trying to make a change. So I started this organization, Ideas Beyond Borders, which is mainly one of our social media strategies when we started, is really combining all the main social influencers in the region and combining all of our following to 4.7 million. So in that way, we become a major source of content in the region. And our mission is to create a positive alternative to misinformation, to authoritarianism, and fill the knowledge gap that exists in a significant amount of the population, and provide a positive alternative. And one key thing of our organization is critical thinking. And I believe, I mean, we're talking COVID times, but critical thinking, we believe, is a vaccine against misinformation and fake news and all forms of extremist propaganda, state-run or non-state-run. And so in that way, we're teaching people how to think, not what to think. We figured out that there are a lot of organizations that are in the fact-checking business, always trying to correct every conspiracy theory. But based upon the scene that we see, there's a conspiracy theory embedded every 30 seconds. So trying to combat every misinformation out there, we believe to be ineffective, but in the long run. So we believe that in the long run, that if we empower people with the tools of critical thinking, understanding cognitive biases, understanding logical fallacies, that will create a vaccine and kind of ammunition against a lot of the propaganda that we see. And sometimes people make the mistakes is that just because they happen to be educated or they get information and they know how to use the internet means that they are also not immune to cognitive biases. Many of us have feelings, and many of us are, to some extent, susceptible to a lot of misinformation that exists on the internet because we have feelings towards certain prime minister or certain political party. So in that way, this opportunists who are trying to create misinformation really play a lot on that side. So one of also our techniques and mechanisms is really allocate and elevate local voices that exist in the region. As Bob Pearson mentioned about authority, there's a lot of distrust within the certain population that we deal with kind of larger authorities, with the state or other. So there's now a lot of new local authorities or local voices. So empowering them with the critical thinking skills, empowering them with knowledge and making them a voice of reason would be powerful on the long run, trying to change the landscape. So just a quick recap. So our target audience is mainly the Middle Eastern youth. We work a bit in Iran and in Turkey and Kurdistan, but mainly our audience tend to be from the Arabic-speaking world. And our main tools is we equip the audience with critical thinking skills, logical fallacies, etc., to create a long solution and ammunition for misinformation, misinformation, fake news in the region. So with that, I leave it to Bob. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Faisal. I have a bunch of questions for you. And I just mentioned to everyone on the line that if you have questions as you're thinking about them, put them in the chat room and we'll either answer them right away or we'll save them to the Q&A. Now let's go to Sean Powers, who has a very big picture view of what's happening across the world and can dig more into what's happening with disinfo. Sean, floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you also, Bob, for organizing this and the invitation, and thanks to everyone for their participation. It's great to be able to continue these kinds of discussions despite the conditions that we all are dealing with. When thinking about the future of disinformation, I can't help but try to kind of zoom out a little bit and think about it in broad strokes. And I think part of that is because on a day-to-day basis, the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which operates in 61 languages and 100+ markets around the world, really is dealing with it, day in, day out, as journalists are chasing down stories, and disinformation, unfortunately, is rampant in the vast majority of markets that we operate in. But I think what I try to add to that kind of day in, day out perspective is what is the strategic framework that we can use to understand these efforts, and how can these efforts work together holistically to try to create a world where disinformation is less effective, less pervasive, and eventually less catastrophically damaging to our societies. So that's sort of the framework that I bring to the table today. I want to make just 3 points briefly, and then try to get to the question and answer session, which I'm keen to hear about from you all as well. But the first point is just emphasizing the need to think about disinformation from a holistic, all of society perspective. Disinformation thrives in markets where trust in media and trust in official institutions are on the decline. People look for answers or explanations for current events, and if they can't trust their local and national media, or if those outlets simply aren't addressing the issues that a community is experiencing day in, day out, then they are going to turn to alternative fora for their informational needs. And that's where disinformation thrives. Similar to how germs and infection thrive in an unhealthy body, disinformation thrives in an unhealthy informational ecosystem. And so we need to focus on that ecosystem in its entirety. The question then becomes, for me, what constitutes a healthy informational ecosystem? How do we build trust in a media ecosystem where trust is already started to evaporate? And there's some pretty good empirical research on this question from the social sciences. First is you need robust protections for free and independent press. Those protections, of course, have to also function alongside a responsible, professionalized journalistic core. So this is not to say we need sort of unfettered, anything goes, you can say anything you want, and that's going to create trust. In fact, just the opposite. We need legal protections for journalists to chase down very difficult stories that hold people accountable. At the same time, we need journalists who can be trusted to take their job seriously and can be trusted to do as much as possible to find as much information and be held accountable for how they tell those stories. We also need transparency laws and transparency laws that are actually enforced, that make sure that sufficient information from governmental institutions and from corporations is made public for communities to better understand the operations of these massive, massive endeavors that really shape their lives day in, day out. We also need a healthy media ecosystem also requires a real capacity to hold people accountable and a demonstrable capacity to do so, not just a stated capacity, but examples where media can call out behavior that needs to be addressed in a more systematic way. And then lastly, you also need resources. You need sustainable resources to support a plurality of perspectives that can address the variety of questions that communities are raising. And so one of the interesting things that the University of Oxford has found when they study disinformation around the world is that on average, you see less catastrophic disinformation in countries where public service media are better funded. And the rationale there is that the more public resources that are dedicated to kind of fact-finding, an independent fact-finding mission through an entity like a public service media organization like the BBC, the more likely you are to have trust in your national media ecosystem, and the less likely disinformation can be catastrophically kind of propagated in any particular environment. The last thing I'd say on kind of what constitutes a healthy media ecosystem is the need for everyone to recognize that the most effective disinformation at the end of the day stems from some sort of kernel of truth that needs to be addressed. Effective conspiracy theories aren't made up out of whole cloth. They stem from a legitimate grievance that's gone unaddressed, or a legitimate challenge that the communities feel has not been addressed in a publicly satisfying way, and in a way that provides closure to those who have been harmed. And so, in as much as we try to combat disinformation narratives, we need to recognize that identifying that kernel of truth, what's the truthful piece of information that's driving this successful disinformation campaign, and then better understand what has to be discussed related to that kernel of truth to better improve the public's understanding of what's actually going on. One more point about this healthy ecosystem that I want to raise, which I'm curious for some feedback, which is sometimes when I describe this to folks, they say, oh yeah, we understand it's the Western model of a free press. And I think that's really harmful, because what I'm describing here is actually a healthy media ecosystem is essential for any functioning society, regardless of if it's a democratic government or if it's a non-democratic government. A society that's rife with disinformation cannot function from an economic perspective, from a rule of law perspective, regardless of if you're the United States or you're Russia or China or Iran. And so I think we need to collectively make a business case that protecting a free, independent, and trusted media ecosystem is crucial to the healthy functioning of a society, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum of democracy or not democracy. And that's crucial, because I think in as much as this gets trapped in a debate of what is the best way to govern a country, that really does not help us in combating disinformation as a global phenomenon. Second thing I wanted to emphasize just quickly was the need to isolate and campaign against pervasive disinformation that actually causes harm. And I've got one example that I want to throw out there, which is a poll that was conducted about 2 weeks ago in Turkey. It found that 37% of the respondents believe that the United States had produced the COVID virus to quote unquote hurt China, and a separate 40% of the population said they believe that the virus was produced in a Chinese laboratory to harm the world. So that's collectively 77% of the Turkish population thinks that COVID is basically a biological weapon of some sort. And that's terrifying, right? I think anyone who hears that is like, oh man, this is really bad. And it is, but I also want to put this in context. Here's the question. Do we know if that fact that there's lots of speculation about the origins of COVID in Turkey, do we know if that actually shapes how people act? Does that shape how anyone is social distancing or not social distancing in Turkey? I doubt it. I wonder if asked after they took that survey, if they were asked, what do you really think? Or do you really believe that China or the United States invented this? And they would say, well, I don't know, it's just what I heard, but I'm not sure if it's true. There's no context around this fact. And then third, do we actually have sufficient information that would allow us to, in a compelling way, correct the record? And what I mean there are any number, dozens and dozens of experts all around the world right now that are trying to better understand everything about the COVID pandemic, everything about it. And obviously, I'm a firm believer that COVID did not come into this world as a biological weapon, period, full stop. But until we have a full set of facts that really can be articulated in a way that is compelling and can be articulated in a way from trusted interlocutors, I'm not sure there's much we can do to rectify the situation in Turkey as it relates to the origins of the coronavirus. And I think it's better for us to just acknowledge that certain disinformation campaigns or realities just have to exist until we have a proper level of documentation and fact-finding available to really correct the record. And with that in mind, I start to think about what are the disinformation campaigns that really matter, and the ones that are shaping people's actual lived lives and the realities. And just to give you an example, two come to mind right away. The first is the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghur population in China, which is a cultural genocide by any stretch of the imagination, and continues to be denied not only by the Chinese government, but by their allied governments all around the world. That is a disinformation campaign that has real consequences for over a million people, millions of people, and we need to focus on it because we can actually correct the record and hopefully stop the atrocities. I think to a similar extent, the Russian invasion of Crimea, which to today remains an act, a violation of international law that has day-to-day consequences for the reality of people living in Crimea, is another example of disinformation that has had real consequences, that we have plenty of facts to correct the record and really try to get a course corrected in terms of what we know about these situations. And so in those situations, I think thinking about correcting the record is less about the whack-a-mole approach that we all are very familiar with and more about a transmedia storytelling approach. Think about it like how Hollywood embraces a franchise of storytellers to propagate any particular set of characters. Think about the Marvel stories that build off one another with central characters and themes, but at the end of the day, you've got movies built on Netflix TV shows, built on comic books, built on top of in-person events that all intertwine in a way that are mutually reinforcing. We need to take that transmedia storytelling approach and think about how do we combat these major disinformation campaigns that are having real consequences for human beings, and then build a strategy, a transmedia storytelling strategy that includes video games, that includes reaching out to stakeholders and educators, that includes embedding messages in popular programming and movies, all at the same time to build a reinforcing message that corrects the record and really reorients public attitude on these big issues. And I want to give a quick shout out to the Hollywood Health and Society group at USC that's been doing that work in particular, kind of getting factual information embedded in popular content as it relates to health in particular, to make sure that when there's a show like Grey's Anatomy, that they're actually talking about diseases in a way that's factually accurate, and people are not getting disinformation through their consumption of TV programming. I have a couple more things I want to say, but I realize I'm over my time and I want to be respectful, so I'll save it for later. Thank you, guys.
Great, thank you, Sean. And it's interesting listening to Faisal and yourself. There's this analogy of a healthy system, which makes me think of like health in general. And as you were talking, I'm thinking of, if you have hypertension or diabetes and you don't pay attention to it, it may not impact you right away, but it does impact you long term. And so I think that's really ultimately what you're getting at, is we have to address the cumulative impact of disinformation as opposed to always just focusing on what's happening that moment today. Very, very well said. Let's now move to Franek. And Franek, I think you're going to show us some slides and get into another angle on disinformation.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for organizing all these discussions. And I think it's just the beginning, because a lot of things going on in the space. On one hand, I am always saying that that's the best time for media. We never had such opportunities to spread the content to reach the populations. But on the other hand, that's the best time for dictators and for disinformation creators to spread their narratives. So I'd like to raise some issues regarding the general disinformation trends. I hope you can see my screen. So first of all, I try to answer the question how the future of disinformation will look like. And the number one is ephemeral. It will be ephemeral. It will exist for a short period of time. It will be hard and impossible to trace it, to track it, to identify it. So it's similar somehow to cyber operations and to cyber attacks. We feel the damage, but we don't know who is behind it. So the popularity of such forms of content, like stories, like messages that disappear on secret chats, groups, discussion boards on Reddit, Facebook, Telegram, that's all part of this general trend. The major idea of this content is not to create something substantial like infrastructure that will exist, will destroy the West, Brussels, and Washington, but it's more about to seed specific ideas, narratives, doubts, conflicts. It's seeding in the minds of people and weaponizing people's accounts. From our research at USAGM and what we do at Office of Policy and Research, we are trying to identify major trends and to alert if something's going wrong and to find a way to help journalists. What I see that the biggest, not producers, but distributors and amplifiers of this information are actually those who supposed to help media, journalism, and pluralism in different societies. So this information is so nice, colorful, sexy that people with huge followership, they spread these narratives, ideas, and they're not accountable for doing this. Another major trend is the hidden part of this information, the hidden part of the internet. All these bad guys, they receive the perfect platform to spread this malign ideas, influences, basically lies and false informations in the part of the internet that cannot be Googled. We call it deep web. So when we Google, we can find the website of USAGM, Voice of America. We can join this webinar because it's Googleable. But the owner of apartment I rent here in Minsk, she's living in Viber chats, and I don't have clue what is she reading there and how to join this chat, because it's her own community which is hidden from public eye, from journalists, from fact checkers, from investigators, from anyone who can stop the spread of this information. The next thing, it's branding part. Since the very beginning of the internet and general marketing, modern marketing, all companies, entrepreneurs, they were working to empower their brands. And these brands were the major resource. So this is why Coca-Cola, Apple are so expensive, because having this brand behind you, you can sell whatever you want. But for disinformation purposes, you don't need strong brand, because it's easy to identify and to prevent, to stop it, to fact check it. All the West is watching Russia Today, Sputnik, and other open pro-Russian media, but no one pays attention to smaller groups that also belong to Russia Today. Soapbox, Was That, In the Now, these are all part of Russia Today consortium. They are all financed from Kremlin. They have millions of followers and hundred millions of video views on social networks, but we do not pay attention because they use another brand. And for us, it's almost impossible to track all of them. Propaganda will be cheap. It is cheap. Sometimes it's free. And this is major reason why Telegram Messenger became so popular. When you have $1 million, you can open TV channel in Eastern Europe or Central Europe, in Southeast Asia. When you have 100,000, you can make the newspaper or a radio. But if you have nothing or you have 1,000, you can start Telegram to become super popular and do whatever you want. Telegram is also cool because you are not responsible for the information. You can make it anonymous. And this is why China, and not only China and Russia, they're actively buying groups, pages, popular accounts, basically assets on Telegram, on Instagram, and other popular, especially among young people, social platforms. So here are screenshots made by my friends who were proposed money for posting pro-Chinese posts. And today, actually this morning, my friend got another proposal from Moscow asking to sell the group with Belarusian political news. The group has 40,000 subscribers, and this person proposed $80,000, which is quite a lot for young people managing the channel for free, for free time. And unfortunately, after this deal will be made, this person in Moscow will get a huge power thanks to this authenticity protection. The next trend is distributed. It will be distributed, it will be segmented, it will be targeting very niche groups. So instead of large and powerful, disinformation chose small and many. And this is where they target and they employ influencers. I know Bob likes this topic. I'm a big fan of this topic. I feel that the future of media are influencers and influencers projects because of many factors. But unfortunately, good guys didn't learn how to involve, engage influencers, in contrast to propagandists and disinformation creators. So it will be also automated. So when we speak about disinformation on Facebook or YouTube, BBC made actually a huge research a few days ago, and they revealed that China has many networks similar to what Russia was doing for years. Coordinated network of pages, of accounts on different social platforms. So what they do, it's not about coordination, it's about coordinated multiplication only. Sometimes these groups, these pages, they do belong to different people, they do not have direct dependencies, but they have agreement that at the specific moment X, they share specific news, specific information, they are just mobilized. And 90% of their time, they just build infrastructure, build followership, build capacity, and only remaining 10%, they weaponize these structures. And don't forget, that's the screenshot from USAGM Digital Trends Report. And here you can see emerging non-mainstream social media platforms. We are too focused on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. So we are missing the platforms which are created by Russia, by smaller countries. There is social network created by Lebanese developers and financed by Lebanese government. And many people, not in biggest countries, but in underserved regions, they are consumers, they are users of these networks. And we don't have any strategy or approach how to reach them and how to provide them with alternative, objective, fact-based information. China is a big investor in technology. Technology, it's fuel for disinformation in the future. These are a screenshot of infographics about where you can see companies with Chinese investments. So basically, they have a small piece of pie in each sector of tech. It's authentic. That's obvious thing. That's screenshots from this mentioned above BBC investigation.
Franek, just want to add, I think you're close to the end. I just want to make sure we leave enough time for Q&A.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I can finish right here, and we can discuss it later.
Okay, great, excellent. I just wanted, because we're getting some great questions coming in. That's great information. I want to start out with a question that came in from Jeffrey Trimble, who you guys know from USAGM. He's now teaching a class at Ohio State, among other things, on disinformation and how to counter it. And he asked if you know, Sean, you made a good point about populations in countries with strong public media being less susceptible to disinformation. Does this apply to authoritarian societies as well? Do countries where the state controls or dominates the media environment, or is this true only in open societies such as the UK, which has BBC? Great question.
Yeah, great question. And the answer is it depends on whether or not the quote unquote public service media institution operates in a way that generates substantial trust from the publics, which most in most contexts, Jeff, means that authoritarian publicly funded propaganda actors not going to sufficiently provide, they're going to trusted day in day out news that publics need to feel like they're really understanding what's going on in their societies. And so it sort of the other conditions that I articulated, the importance of independence from political institutions, substantial funding for a variety of perspectives, and the capacity to hold people accountable, really, I think, structure the reasons why public service media can be so helpful.
Yeah, and I think, Sean, I'll just add, if we look at COVID-19 and what we see happening in real time, is that when we think of censorship, we think that people are just blocking things. We don't, but like in the case of China, China is blocking content that is not favorable to the country from coming in, but they're also letting content come in to the country that actually supports their cause that may also not be true. So censorship is actually a two-way street that really is propaganda and censorship combined. And so I think Jeffrey's raising a great point that you answered. It's a tough one. Let's go, we have another question here, which is from Si Chang Yang on, for the panel last year, there was quite a bit of discussion on deep fakes and its use in disinformation. However, maybe with greater awareness, it did not seem to have taken off. What in your view is the next big trend in the area of disinformation that we need to watch? So let's ask everyone on the panel, and maybe Faiz will start with you. What's the next big trend in disinformation?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, one of the, and that may not be the full answer, but one of the things that we're watching closely is the fact that one of the major networks in the Middle East is Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera has been losing a lot of trust in mainly in the general media because of the involvement of Qatar and many places around the region, and what I think on a regional basis, I think that it is possible that some of these channels, in order for them to adapt, there was some news recently about the fact that Al Jazeera started their own fact-checking channel without it being called Al Jazeera, but it's funded by the same source. So one possible way that I can think of a new trend is that the fact-checking websites become a source of misinformation. Many of these, there is no kind of credential that you need to have to be a fact-checking website. And the fact that when now many of these, I mean, in the Arab world, as far at least we can identify four major social media pages that became a fact-checking websites, and I'm saying that some of them are having some biases. So there is a possibility that now, as more people, as the panel explained, that there's a loss of trust, a loss of, so in that way, in order for them, one of the things that we always have to learn about authoritarians is that they are very adaptable. They adapt to the current times as much as, in some cases, better than free societies do, because they have a more centralized approach to things. So that's one of the things that I think they might be able to adapt to, is that they become, they utilize that mistrust in the public media, push them towards some extent other forms of fact checking or reliable source, quote unquote, and then be able to push their agenda there. So that would be one thing I can think of, but I'm sure there are many.
Great. And Faz, I'll just add, I think one thing that we always say is people who are leading repressive societies or repressing their societies, facts are not relevant to them. And I always say they're not capable of being embarrassed. So you have to think of other ways to reach people. Ronak, what do you actually outlined some really cool or important, I shouldn't say cool because they're not cool, important trends. But what would you say is the most important trend that you're thinking about?
So that's a question to me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I wanted here to, because part of this question was about deep fakes, right? Can I start with deep fakes thing? Because I think deep fakes is the trend that we have to follow, but this is not the trend which will change the whole world of disinformation tomorrow. Deep fakes are evolving, they're getting more accessible, it's more easy to do. You know, I saw, for example, you know, so many fakes with Elon Musk after this rocket launch in Russian speaking internet. And actually, I was not able to define what are fakes, what are not. But the thing is that you don't need to create deep fake to confuse people. It's enough just, you know, to drop some messages in different channels or different social media groups, like I heard here there is gossip like this, and that's enough. It's still working. But after people get more media literate, then propaganda creators, they will need to employ more savvy tools like deep fakes. But what we have to follow, we have to collaborate with companies, with messengers, with platforms, especially those that provide opportunity of communicating under surface. We need to get, you know, information about the groups, what people discuss there, because major fakes, the most terrible, the most dangerous discussions and narratives are seeded there in this hidden part of the internet. And that's the biggest problem, which doesn't have any solution.
And Fanik, I wanted to ask a little more on that, is because I think you outlined it really well in terms of people are able to hide. There's a lot of the web where you can go into private places and figure out and then come out publicly. Does that mean that we have to do better? We have to build better listening platforms. We have to look at better behavioral cues, different psychological models. Like, is there another generation of tools and techniques we have to develop?
I guess behavior analysis is the key here. We need to understand what are motivators for people to go there to share information, and everything is built around it. And we have to understand also to predict the steps ahead of our opponents of democracy, Western values, because it's possible to predict what they do, how they will work. If we will prepare for the situation in 2-3 years, it will be easier to respond. When we are reactive, we will be always losing.
And Sean, what do you see as the biggest trend ahead of us for disinfo?
I was really hoping, by the way, that Fanik would actually have responded to that question with a deep fake of his own. That was my hope, but maybe next time, Fanik. I think one interesting kind of cyclical trend that I've noticed is that you know, consumers jump from platform to platform. You know, there's MySpace, there's Facebook, there's Instagram, there's Telegram, and as a platform becomes more popular amongst users for news consumption, then you see a variety of commercial and nefarious interests hop to those platforms as well. And over time, you begin to see that those disinformation interests kind of pollute the trust that had been developed on those ecosystems, and then people leave. People stop trusting news on Facebook. They stop going to Telegram to find out about what's going on in the world, and they jump to something else. And we've seen it now in 4 or 5 cycles, and it's unsustainable, both from the user perspective. People are simply going to lose trust in news, period. And also from the policy perspective, governments are increasingly looking at how to govern this space so that Platforms can't just pop up and be used to spread hate, extremist rhetoric, and or disinformation. And so I think what I'm alluding to is the trend I am concerned about is public policy as it relates to these platforms and what governments do in an overzealous moment to try to rein in platforms that may be being used in ways that are very nefarious and counterproductive. But to go to my first point that I made when I opened up is we need to find ways to support a independent, robust, and sustainable media ecosystem, and that certainly means we need to avoid overzealous government regulation of this space. So that's an area that I keep my eyes closely focused on.
Great, Sean, and you know, as you're talking about that, with that's I think the debate that we're not having now is what policy changes are actually helpful versus, like, you know, how do we punish the platforms, right? And we're just having the wrong conversation, going against Facebook, going against, you know, rather than say what would work so we have a free and open society worldwide. Great point. Faisal, you just commented in the chat room about Facebook and media literacy and the efforts there. And there's an interesting point that I believe in very much, which is we have to teach people about identifying disinformation so they understand how to protect themselves. You're doing some of that now through Ideas Beyond Borders. You're saying Facebook could do more. Talk to us about that. What does that mean to do more?
So thank you, Rob. I mean, as I mentioned, is that, I mean, we implement these strategies within our organization, which has 4.7 million followers on Facebook. So Facebook has been really a major platform of distribution of our content, and also our target audience within the Middle East use Facebook heavily. So Facebook is one of the most used platforms in the region, and we have created a critical thinking series that has created before COVID, but also has been repurposed for COVID, that is focused on media literacy, founding example of sensational media, how to avoid sensational headlines, what are, and even like touching sometimes in a kind of more humorous way of kind of the WhatsApp groups and aunties sending cures for COVID, kind of trying to reach the audience where it is. And as I said, is that our methodology is that we focus on telling people how to think, not what to think. So we try sometimes to avoid just touching on every conspiracy there is. And one of the things that we also implemented, which is that we teach people the basics, is that what is a vaccine? So we create videos on basics like that, and how, so that way we kind of create the framework for people to think. Can somebody be responsible for creating a person? Can one person be responsible? Is it even possible? So other than them trying to, oh, Bill Gates created that, or etc. But other than focusing on the Bill Gates, because when you have a fertile ground for conspiracies, when people, if you make a video pro Bill Gates, you'll be accused of working for Bill Gates, and that's actually what happened with some of the fact-checking platforms. So we have set this video series, and in which we teach people how to fish between fake news and more evidence-based news, how to look for the evidence, how to make an argument, what are the most common cognitive biases when you are when you're reading news on your news feed, confirmation bias, etc. And we made them very short. Many of them are 1 minute, 1 minute and a half. And the average viewership is somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million per video. Most of that audience is more the younger crowd, and we believe it's really working. We're getting a lot of messages, a lot of testimonials and feedback from people who would be like, "Oh, I didn't think of that before. I wish I was introduced to that." And we have been actually having conversation with Facebook itself. Facebook has a Bureau of Public Policy that we were connected to recently, and also have conversation with Jigsaw, which is kind of the part of Google Ideas, which is responsible for that. And I don't think that we can, as I said, there's a conspiracy being created every 30 seconds or every minute. We cannot be dealing with each one of them. So getting these other, always constantly punishing what is fake news and what is not. It's especially when you're talking about authoritarian societies like within the Middle East, you don't want to give the government more powers. You don't want to give the government more power to censor information and to tell what is right and what's wrong, because in some cases that will be used against human rights activists, it's going to be used against dissidents of all sorts. So we don't want to give, so the solution have to lay to some extent within Facebook and social media companies to do. And if they will able, I mean, as far as I know, they are creating some support to, we haven't gotten it yet, but we're in the conversation of really empowering media literacy organizations in the Middle East. So in that way, they're able to get these like videos that they create, content that they create, to people who have in the region. And within our policy, I mean, that is without Facebook support, is that when we create a counter conspiracy theory video, in Facebook targeting, when we create a Facebook boost to the, we actually target people, for example, who like Russia Today page, who we believe have been exposed to Russia Today conspiracies before. So in that way, when we're trying to teach people about conspiracies, we target what are the most likely sources where the audience, the same audience we're reaching to, are receiving these conspiracies. So these are, I think that Facebook and social media companies, other than as I said, like punish them, there are definitely ways that we can work together. I still believe, and I'm very optimistic that Facebook has been a great resource for many youth in the region to express their frustrations, to be able to have their voice that they otherwise wouldn't be able to within the controlled state media infrastructure. So I believe that Facebook and social media played a very big role, and a positive role in many cases within the Middle East. And I think is that if we can work together, we can definitely have better solutions.
Great. So I'm going to ask one more question that came in from the chat room, and then ask each of you after that to then I'm going to ask Pranik and Sean for this next question, and then have just one answer as a final one place you would recommend people go for more information. So Si Chang Yang also talked about the elections and said maybe we're seeing less disinformation in currently. Is that accurate? And I'll just give my personal view on that, which is that, and I want to ask Pranik next on this. I believe the best disinformation looks like information. So there's all this stuff that looks totally fake, which it's very easy to see. But people are getting more and more sophisticated to make it harder for us to actually decipher it. So I would say it's actually at an all-time high. It's just harder for us to actually find it. And that gets me to proxy networks, because, Pranik, you talked about $500 per post to be pro-China, $10,000 to buy your outlet. This isn't an isolated example. This is actually a strategy to build a network worldwide. Talk about proxy networks, like what's actually going on to build all that stuff.
So I can start, perhaps Sean can add here. So I think we need our own proxy networks. And on the one hand, we see what disinformation creators are doing. And perhaps it's controversial, but we have to learn from them at some point, because they don't invest much resources in building infrastructure to traditional old school media outlets, organizations, NGO, media literacy programs. They just empower those who are most susceptible to these lies and propaganda and fakes. What we have to do, we have to find our own influencers, our own proxy networks, especially in smaller countries and underserved communities and societies, to give them tools, information, motivate them, create special incentives for them to be with us, and this will empower in thousands times our impact. And we have two points. We have also to think how to create safe places, because unfortunately, I must say that websites of Voice of America or Radio Free Europe in countries with no democracy are not these safe places, and there is always ceiling. So we see, for example, in Ukraine, that there is a growth of audience on Facebook, but no more people joining, because all the people who are not afraid, who want to be exposed to this information, they are max. So we have to create, some other spaces for those who are not ready to be part of this community. So we have to create sub-communities, and we have to realize that the world is multilingual. We still do so much content in big languages, in Mandarin, Russian, English. That was a strategy for dozens of years, but it doesn't work. You know, the content in local, smaller languages, it's the most authentic. It's since 80s actually. Soviets were doing this, you know, when they were trying to find supporters in local communities or organize partisan movements. That they were speaking local languages, small dialects, because it helps them to gain the trust. And we have to invest more. So USAGM is doing a lot in this. For example, we have opened, you know, many, even Tatar Bashkir, for example, service, which is very tiny group, quite tiny group in Russia. But, you know, it has tremendous impact on the society because there is no other independent outlet in this language in Tatarstan.
Sean, would you like to add to that?
Franek did a great job, you know, and I know we're short on time, Bob, so I think that's good.
Okay. Okay, so let's go, Sean, start with you. Like, where do people go? And we'll put this in a post that is in the follow-up too. Best place to go for more information.
Yeah, so I want to give Franek a lot of kudos here. He puts together a digital trends newsletter on a weekly basis for us that I think is the best place to go for tracking all things disinformation related. And really congratulations to Franek for putting that together. And related is my team here at USAGM recently put together a really exhaustive report on disinformation trends and solutions that we'll be putting out on our website in about a week or so. And I think that's going to be a great resource for folks. And so we'll make sure that the URL is shared with Bob, and so it can be kind of shared more broadly.
Excellent, cool. Faisal?
Not to be self-promoted here, but I think, I mean, our critical thinking series is available on our social media platforms, social media pages. Our program is called the House of Wisdom 2.0, which is named after the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. It was a center of knowledge and translation. So our identity is kind of, we built it tied to the region. So the Arabic is BAYTALHIKMA2.org. And then people can access our critical thinking series. And we also partnered with Wikipedia Arabic and Wikipedia Levant in the region. So all of the articles about COVID-19 in Arabic are removed from all forms of misinformation. So in that way, all of the people who are searching for COVID and they see Wikipedia in the first thing, in Google or other search engines, they find that the articles about COVID are correct and they're well scientifically referenced. So in that way, we kind of tackle that audience. We expanded a bit now to Farsi. So articles on misinformation of COVID-19 in Farsi is also available in Wikipedia Farsi today, as of yesterday. Same with Kurdish. So we have, I mean, so people in that case don't need to go to our website. They can actually go to Wikipedia Arabic and they see that all of the articles there are well scientifically referenced. They match what other Wikipedias in the world, Wikipedia German, Wikipedia English, and that's what I would say is that we have improved Wikipedia in terms of references. We have, as of now, we have done 16,000 articles. So our team is about 120 around the region. So we're constantly working 24/7. But also on the same side, we have original content that is focused on media literacy and critical thinking, which is accessible in our website.
Okay, cool. And Franek, you were already singled out for a source. Anything else that comes to mind? All good?
Not all good, all good.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah,
Great.
all sources are good, but we have to compare and check.
Okay, thank you. So it's a great panel. We will be doing, thank you for everyone for listening. We'll be doing a summary of this. We'll have links to it. That will go out to the Stratcom World audience, and we'll also put that on LinkedIn and a few other places. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to all of our speakers. We appreciate your time, to our participants as well. Clearly, this is a fascinating and a sobering discussion. It could go on longer. That's why we've had this topic on our Stratcom World program each year for the last several years, and it will be next May as well. If you're not familiar with our conference, please have a look at www.stratcom.world, and you can see the full agenda and our speakers and what we're aiming for in the next conference.